You have the...
Everybody. Thanks, Mr. Jose Maria Escobar, for your introduction. Thanks to UNODC, INEGI, and CONSTAT, and to all the people who participate in the organization, realization, and promotion of this interesting conference. And thanks to all of you for your large participation to this panel on data and research to understand the infiltration of organized crime in the legal economy. The inclusion of this panel in this year's conference is very topical, as the spread of the social and economic crisis induced by the COVID-19 from one side increases the risk of infiltration of organized crime in many different contexts and in many different countries. And on the other side, it underlines the need for the development of more sophisticated and better statistical tools to analyze this form of crime. Indeed, in many respects, the statistical and empirical analysis of infiltration of organized crime in the legal economy is at an early stage of development and do not provide us with the instruments that we have to analyze, comprehend, and face other types of complex crimes. So today, starting from busy promises, is both a pleasure and an honor to have with us four well-known experts in the analysis of complex crimes that will guide us through the analysis and understanding of cutting-edge approaches to the quantitative investigation of infiltration of organized crime in the legal economy, and at the same time, in their debates, will provide us with proposition on how to increase our capacity, our statistical capacity to measure this crime, collect relevant information, and build policies and build policy analysis that help us in facing this crime. In this respect, as a first panelist, we will have Patricio Estévez-Soto from UCL, who will focus on a very quintessential form of relation between organized crime and legal businesses. Indeed, Estévez' presentation will focus on new methodologies to measure and predict the victimization of the forms of extortion by organized crime in the context of Mexico. As second panelist, we will have Ms. Rusudan Mikhelidze, who works at the Anti-Corruption Network for Eastern European and Central Asia of the OECD, who will talk about the novel methodology to investigate and measure corruption performances. While the focus of the presentation is indeed on the measurement of corruption performances, this methodology that she will be present will provide a lot of best practices and examples on how to build a statistical approach to investigate complex crime. Our third panelist is going to be Ms. Julia Mould, representing the Financial Services Volunteer Corps, and Ms. Mould will present a new strategy to analyze adaptive behavior and money laundering scheme and patterns that exploit information at the micro level, in particular financial transaction level. Finally, Mr. Michele Riccardi from Università Cattolica and Transcrime will reason on the concept of infiltration of organized crime in the legal economy. So he will reason about what we intend by this, and at the same time, it will provide an overview of different methodology that have been adopted to investigate this topic, starting from direct to arrive to indirect measures. We will then have a panel section in which the audience will have the opportunity to address questions to our four panelists. So without further hesitation, I leave the floor to Mr. Estévez-Soto for his presentation titled Improving the Measurement of Extortion Victimization, the Case of Mexico.
Thank you so much. Alberto, can you hear me?
I do. Yes. I see and hear you.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Just checking there for a second. Anyway, so hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this session. I'm happy to join you since from my living room / kitchen / dining room, but such is the pandemic. And it's actually quite nice that we have a very large number of participants, over 563, I can see. I think it would be, we would be hard pressed to find auditorium that large for our standard in-person conference. So, you know, it's great that we're able to continue this conversation, this conference online. I'm going to share my screen now just to share the presentation. There we go. So I'll jump straight into my talk on improving the measurement of extortion victimization, the case of Mexico. As a background, this presentation comes as is the distillation, the main implications of a 5-year-long research project that was my PhD, which coincidentally was inspired by the first conference of governance, crime, and justice statistics by INEGI UNODC in Aguascalientes. When I went to that conference some years ago now, and I learned about extortion victimization and victimization surveys, and I decided to do my PhD about them. So it's actually nice and interesting. It's nice to close the circle and finally present the findings of that really long research into this forum, which is the one that inspired the research. So very briefly, I'll talk about the problem of extortion. I'll talk about measuring extortion victimization, the types of extortion we face in Mexico, and how these measurements are flawed and how we can improve them. And lastly, I will have some concluding remarks. So as Alberto very well said, extortion is the quintessential, is often viewed as a quintessential organized crime activity. There are many definitions of organized crime that conflate extortion and organized crime, and for some researchers, you can't have organized crime if you don't have extortion, and if you have extortion, you have organized crime. And it is an obvious example of the infiltration of organized crime into the legal economy. It is a crime that has very big economic, political, and social implications. In the economic side, it has it can discourage investment, in addition to being a direct cost to many businesses that can be equated as a tax, but in this case, an illicit tax on economic activity. Politically, can have also very big consequences. For example, in the case of Mexico, one of the biggest security and political crises we've had in the past decades has been the surge of self-defense movements in the countryside, which started as a direct response against extortion of avocado and other farmers in the countryside. Lastly, it can also have very big social implications, and the picture we see there is a good example of that, as that is the ruins of a casino in northern Mexico, the Casino Royale, which refused to pay extortion demands and was burned down to the ground with customers inside, after refusing to pay extortion demands to the Zetas, a very deadly organized crime group. And there in the picture, we can also see the president of Mexico at the time and the governor of the state and other public servants mounting an honor guard in front of that business, because that was the deadliest attack of organized crime against civil society in Mexico up until that time. So it's a good example to see how extortion can also lead into violence and other human costs. When extortion is endemic and widespread, it is tied to the phenomenon of extra-legal governance, and that's a situation where organized crime comes to dominate certain aspects of social life and certain territories in a particular country. However, measuring extortion is not particularly straightforward. In the case of Mexico, administrative records, those that come from reports made to the police, for example, are not really reliable because those measurements have a very large dark figure. That means that most extortion incidents are not reported to the police. In the case of Mexico, I think it's around 98% of incidents of extortion are not reported to the police. So whatever measurements we get from reported extortion from administrative records are not really going to be a good picture of what's going on with extortion. Also, administrative records don't capture the type of victim that was extorted, whether it was a business or a household, and other important information. Thankfully, we have two victimization surveys by INEGI. One is directed at households, and it measures the incidence of crime, but in particular of extortion against households, and the other one, ENVE, measures the incidence and prevalence of extortion against businesses. And we can see in the plot there, in the chart, how extortion has changed over the past decade. And we can see that in the case of businesses, there is a slight upward trend. It's a much higher level of victimization for businesses. And in the case of households, we see that in the past years, extortion has actually declined. The incidence of extortion against households has actually declined. It should also be noted that recent research suggests that extortion concentrates on a few chronic victims that suffer many crimes. However, those trends don't take into account the fact that there are several types of extortion. In Mexico in particular, we have two main types of extortion, that is remote or telephone extortion, which essentially happens that when you get a call from someone claiming to be part of an organized crime group, and they say that they're going to kill you or kill your family, or they have a family member kidnapped, and if you don't pay, they're going to kill them, or they're going to kill you or damage your business. And in the other type, in-person extortion, also sometimes known as cobro de piso, you have offenders that come to your business or come to you in person and ask you for money in exchange for not harming you. And we can see in the same, in the plot here, that the percentage of in-person extortions has fluctuated quite dramatically for the case of businesses. And in 2013, up to 30% of all extortions were in person, and that has declined in the most recent years. And in the case of households, we see the opposite, that extortion against, or in-person extortions against households have increased proportionally in the same period. Now, if you were to look at the other figure and just looked at the trend for extortion against households, you get one picture of the extortion phenomenon. If you don't take into consideration that the type of extortions that are experienced by households are changing, you would come to a incomplete or incorrect conclusion of what's happening with extortion in the country. And it's important to distinguish between the two types of extortion, because extortion types have different concentration patterns. For example, we see that in the case of households, I think it's around 2% of all households experienced around 50% of all telephone extortions, whereas in the case of businesses, in the case of in-person extortions, we had that less than 1% of all businesses experience around 30% of in-person extortion incidents. However, it's also relevant that the risk factors that explain those prevalences and concentrations of extortions are not the same. That means that the characteristics of, for example, businesses that explain why a business was victimized or why did it suffer a remote extortion are not the same that those that explain which businesses are targeted for in-person extortion. Similarly, the success rate, so the likelihood of complying with an extortion demands, varies dramatically between in-person and remote extortion. In the case of, I think, telephone extortions has a success rate of 7%, whereas in the case of in-person extortion, the success rate varies between 40% to 70%. So we're talking about very different crime types with very different modus operandi and very different outcomes and harms for the victims. So very briefly, thinking then about how extortion is measured in the victimization surveys, the victimization surveys usually have two stages, and the ones by INEGI are no exception. In the first stage, called the screening stage, you ask the respondents if they've been a victim of a particular crime, in this case extortion, and how many incidents they suffered in the previous year. In the case of Mexico, extortion types are combined in the screening stage. So they only ask, have you been a victim of extortion? And they don't really go into detail there. Then those that respond that they have been a victim of extortion, they're asked in a second stage called the victim forms, which type of extortion they suffered and other details of the victimization experience. However, because the second part, the victim forms, are capped, there's only a limit to the number of victim forms a particular respondent can fill out. This means that we cannot reliably estimate the incidence and concentration for remote and in-person extortion separately. We can only look at them as a percentage. So as I showed in the previous graph, we can sort of estimate the percentage of victims of incidents that were in-person or remote. But because there is a cap, some victims experience far many more incidents than those allowed by the survey. So some incidents, for example, in the case of businesses, report up to 40 extortion incidents in a year. And we cannot really reliably estimate how many of those were remote and how many of those were in person. So my biggest suggestion from all of these studies is that remote and in-person extortion should be considered as different crimes. Each of them should have their own specific question in the screening stage, and then victims should fill out the specific victim forms following the remote and in-person extortions. It might be important to keep the original questions from the current surveys for a few sweeps, just to assess how the changes of the question have affected the time series. This is primarily from the point of view of not trying to affect the measurement of victimization across the country that these victim surveys provide. However, I think it is very important that they should be considered separately in the survey. So to conclude, because I'm very mindful of the time and I don't want to overuse anything of the time I have allowed, it's very important that we are very specific of the crime type we're dealing with when we're measuring crime, because to prevent crime, we must understand the specific opportunity structures that underpin them. We need to understand the risk factors that fuel them. When we combine two extortion types, the remote and in-person extortion, into one question, that implies assuming that both extortion types, that remote and in-person extortions, are fueled by the same opportunity structures, that they fueled by the same processes and risk factors. The empirical evidence to date strongly refutes that assumption, that they are indeed very different types of crime. So it's very important then that the distinctions between remote and in-person extortion need to be incorporated into the measurement instruments, whether this be victim surveys or administrative statistics, and so that they can therefore inform targeted and tailored crime prevention policies for each of those different crime types. Thank you very much for that, for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion that we're going to have at the end.
Thank you, Patricio, for your very engaging presentation and for your very precise suggestion on this very relevant topic. As you said, we will have the opportunity to discuss more in depth with the audience in the second part of our panel. Then, as briefly I mentioned before, we invited our second panelist, Ms. Rusudan Mikhelidze, to talk about a novel methodology of measuring anti-corruption performances developed by Oecd, as this is a very interesting instrument that not only has the potential of reducing vulnerabilities of organized crime infiltration into the legal economy by directly tackling corruption, but it also promises to stimulate the production of better criminal statistics of hidden behaviors more in general. Indeed, the measurement of corruption and anti-corruption performances provides or may provide a very valuable source of know-how, best practices, and examples to produce comprehensive statistics on complex phenomena such as the infiltration of organized crime into legal economy. Dear Ms. Mikhelidze, the floor is yours, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Alberto, and hello everyone from all over the world. Thank you for allowing me to present our experimental methodology that I hope will inspire others to collect their data and use their data in analysis of organized crime infiltration in other areas of fighting organized crime. In fact, I wanted to start, I will share my slides, and I wanted to start by a little bit of a context of what I'm presenting, and it's a novel methodology of anti-corruption performance measurements in a sub-regional context, in the context of the Istanbul Action Plan under the Anti-Corruption Network for Eastern Europe and Central Asia. In fact, this methodology has been developed in the last 2 years in the wide public consultations, and it is being tested at the moment in the pilot of 5 countries: Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova, with the funding of the European Union. And then it will be used as the basis of peer review in 10 countries. And hopefully at the end of the review, the researchers and the wider community will have a valuable resource for analyzing the data that we collect and for using it in the future. So today I will talk about briefly what the OECD-ACN is and what these anti-corruption performance indicators are about. Just to specify, we are not attempting to measure corruption, and we acknowledge that this is absolutely difficult, very difficult task to achieve. However, there are some visions and perhaps ideas how to approach this topic in the future at the OECD. We are measuring the resilience and vulnerability of existing corruption prevention systems and anti-corruption frameworks with the aim to fight corruption, prevent corruption, and also to, of course, study this phenomenon for better policies, for better lives. At the OECD, our slogan is better policies for better lives, and we apply this in every area of our work. So today I will show you a little bit of what data we are aiming to collect and what challenges we have already encountered in the process. And let's also try to capture a few links with the organized crime infiltration, perhaps during the question and answer. So what is the OECD Anti-Corruption Network peer review program, which is called Istanbul Anti-Corruption Action Plan? You might not be familiar with the program, but I'm sure you are familiar with the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, which has already a long history of implementation, and it has a robust peer review mechanism that Transparency International called gold standard in monitoring, with the working group on bribery in international business transactions, which oversees its implementation. And this is the instrument that is looks at the supply side of the foreign bribery. And so far it has had a great impact in terms of prosecuting individuals and legal entities for foreign bribery, as well as for sanctioning around 17.8 billion US dollars in sanctions have been imposed through foreign bribery actions. And Istanbul Action Plan is based on the peer review program, on the system, but it's applied in the country context, national context, on investigation and prosecution, as well as prevention of corruption in 10 countries. And we have already done 4 rounds of monitoring starting 2003. And the 5th round has indeed novel methodology, which is based on anti-corruption performance indicators. Unlike the previous rounds where we would look at the country context in its national framework and national context, now we're looking and compare it obviously with international standards. Now we have a set of benchmarks and indicators to measure the compliance with international standards and good practices that is relevant to these 10 countries. And the 10 countries are the 5 countries that are already listed, plus Central Asian countries. So what are these performance areas about? Here you have the list of 13, And I'll highlight those that have relevance to preventing or detecting and studying organized crime infiltration. And those are, for example, business integrity, where we look at the compliance programs, and enforcement of liability of legal persons, where we promote the use of the compliance programs in the process of investigation and prosecution of legal persons, and mitigating crimes, and using, for example, different prosecutorial agreements. We have confiscation and asset recovery, and investigation and prosecution of high-level corruption. We also ask the government to collect information and to have the beneficial ownership registries and verify the information about beneficial owners. And we measure, assess the compliance with the relevant indicators on the scale from 0 to 100, with the relevant colors, and a little bit of a peer pressure that we apply on the countries based on these ratings. Now, what is the source of data for our analysis? Because we're assessing the country national frameworks and the practices, we obviously look at the national statistics data, but also we collect information from stakeholders such as civil society groups and business community around perceptions mainly, and allegations, trust to the institutions, and but also this allegations part is really interesting and important, because we are looking at what business community or CSOs told us about concrete cases. And we encourage the government to look into CSO allegations through dedicated benchmarks, which require them to follow up on those allegations. And this can be a really interesting source of detecting the organized crime when looked at it during the complex financial analysis and investigations. So far we have conducted the so-called on-site visits virtually, and literally last week was the final on-sites, and on Monday we ended the one on, for example, on Ukraine, and the reports will be produced in October, but already now we can see that there is a huge issue with the lack of data and lack of unified statistics, and of course the harmonization of data will be key, which is a really difficult challenge, and because the legislation of countries and country context varies so much. But with our methodology, we hope to be able to promote the changes in the statistics system. And we ask countries not only to collect this data, but also to analyze them and show us that they have used this data in changing and adapting their policy. For example, speaking about enforcement data, we ask them to collect data of detection of corruption based on various sources, such as FIU reports and media sources, and then see whether these data has helped them in the analysis of their policy and in changes of their policy. This is obviously a very important source of detection of organized crime infiltration. So on this slide, you can see other enforcement data that we asked them to collect. I will not go into details, but here we saw the challenges of, for example, unified criminal justice statistics, because the statistics of investigation, prosecution, and conviction do not match or stick together, and you cannot take a full picture because there is the unified approach is absent. And while being at the government of Georgia many years ago, I've encountered this similar change myself when working on the memorandum of understanding among 5 state bodies to come up with the unified criminal justice statistics methodology. And the challenge was related to the different counting units, for example, persons versus cases, as well as the lack of continuity of data collection, starting with investigation to sanctioning. Now, and my last slide is justice and how we try to connect these two things together. Again, requiring countries to produce comprehensive criminal justice statistics may push for broader statistics reforms. And now, okay, we're talking about 10 countries, but if this is used also as an inspiration, it can help other countries as well. Again, I repeat myself, the detection of corruption contributes to detection of organized crime infiltration and its understanding and research on it. And finally, compliance with indicators that are aimed at preventing, detecting, investigating, prosecuting, and overall fighting corruption, decrease the vulnerability to corruption, and also decrease the risk of organized crime infiltration. And in this regard, the areas that are listed here, improvements in these areas will significantly contribute to fighting organized crime infiltration. For example, increased independence of judiciary, or increased transparency of beneficial ownership, and liability of legal persons, and whistleblower protection. So that was it. Very briefly, I'd be happy to answer your questions, but I'll be able to answer more questions after we adopt the reports in October at the ACN plenary. And then we go back to the indicators to revise them, to refine them, to see where we have lack of data and how we can harmonize the statistics systems. And in February next year, we will adopt them and launch the full-fledged methodology for the 5th round of monitoring under the Istanbul Action Plan. Thanks again for this opportunity, and looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Rusudan, for your presentation. And we look forward to the publication and adoption of this methodology. And again, I'm very sure that the point that you highlighted and the overall structure that has been at the base of this exercise will be extremely useful also for the analysis of infiltration of organized crime into legal economy. Thank you again, Rusudan. I take the occasion to say that I'm very pleased that we already have a lot of questions in the chat. So keep on posing your questions to our panelists. They will be delighted to interact with you during the roundtable. As a next, in her presentation, Julia Mold from the Financial Service Volunteer Corps will illustrate the use of data or on wire transfer to detect financial crimes. The presentation of Julia Mold will also provide an example of the importance of exploring alternative and new source of information. And at the same time, it will underline the importance of involving different stakeholders and in particular financial institutions in the analysis of the infiltration of organized crime. Dear Ms. Mold, thanks again for joining us today. I now leave the floors to you for your presentation.
Great. Thank you very much, Alberto, and thank you to the UNODC-INEGI and all of the organizers of this important event. I've really enjoyed all of the sessions that I've participated in as a listener and now as a presenter today. And if we could put up the first slide, please. Thanks. We can move to the second slide as well. So today I would really like to share an abbreviated version, much abbreviated, of 2 research projects that were performed in the past 2 years. Next slide, please. Great. So in my view, these projects and the results of the projects really coincidentally illustrate several of the conference themes. And here is a few. They really underline the critical need for relevant and reliable data. Many of the speakers and panelists have commented on this in various aspects. And underlying not only the reliable data is the issues around data quality and data integrity and merging of systems, which is a whole nother conference in and of itself. The second point is that Other commentators, I believe, yesterday mentioned, how do we measure, or how can we capture changes in behavior of criminals? And we'll see very shortly how we can do that, at least in transactional activity. And then the third part, and this is very forward-looking, I believe, is what I refer to as keeping pace. In other words, being able to nimbly react and act to identify new transactional or behavioral patterns, which would indicate an infiltration of a criminal organization, either in a financial institution or in a country or in a variety of aspects in a region. And lastly, I want to also highlight the issue of moving from data to wisdom. We've talked a lot about data, and I'm sure that all the previous speakers and some to come have their own views on data. But I would like to suggest that we move just from a data-driven environment to really wisdom, and use the data in a very dynamic way to inform decision-making, whether that be at a national level, whether that be at an industry level, or across the board. And that informed decision is really in the sphere that I'm going to address today, based on transactional activity. I guess you probably have all read now the overview. The research really was commenced to identify whether changes in transactional activity and in third-party wires could provide any useful insights for financial crime detection and prevention efforts by financial institutions. And these are some of the aspects that we looked at. We looked at shifts in counterparty geographies, shifts and changes in corporate formation types as customers. We looked at some atypical patterns in numeric values used in the wires to move funds from one area to another. And we also addressed the topic of how quickly transactional change seemed to have occurred. Just to go through this briefly, because I really do want to get to the examples. We used two separate data sets because, as I mentioned, this was two different projects. Lots of data downloaded in over a 3-year period in the first data set. Second data set, a slightly more condensed period of 4 months. Nevertheless, after deploying data normalization and removing non-third party, which is bank-to-bank wires, and third-party wires valued at less than $5,000 in US dollars. The final data set contained just under 6,000 wires, and the final data set 2 contained about 17,500 wires. So I think it was a pretty good grouping of wires with which we might be able to draw some conclusions. I want to highlight all of the data was cleansed to mask the identities of financial institutions or countries involved, and there are no names of underlying customers. The data merely serves to support and illustrate the conclusions reached. We could go to the next slide, please, and see the first example. Great. So this is the first data set. There are two examples here. If we look at the upper left quadrant, this is an example of a geographic change. What had happened in this data set was that for many months, in fact, for 8 months, there were 3 countries that were the primary originators, that is, countries where people or companies were sending funds from to this unnamed beneficiary country. And so in the 8th month, suddenly we identified that Nigeria was a primary sending party, or a primary sending country, more correctly, with certain types of corporate entities. And so let me just explain what these acronyms mean. IND means individuals, NTC means non-trading companies, FZ is a free zone, NG is the 2 ISO acronym for Nigeria, CN for China, and HK for Hong Kong. So what we're looking at here is inbound funds from Nigeria, 14 wires, and you see the value just a little bit less than $1 million. But this represented a change. After 8 months of seeing the same countries, I think it was China, Hong Kong, and Canada, sending funds. Suddenly Nigeria popped to the top in this particular range. So this is an example of being able to deploy resources more quickly to address a perceived or potential risk, where in this case, a geographic change. And so the outcome, just to illustrate that there is always an outcome that informs decisions. The outcome was that 4 of these originators, the individuals and companies that were sending these wires, used the same address in Lagos. There was common transactional behavior among these originators, in that almost all of the wires were within $2 of each other. More commonly about 48,995, something to that effect. No information found on any originator or even one of the beneficiary legal entities. So the 14 wires were sent to 2 beneficiary customers, which is an example of inbound funnel activity. If we move on now just a little bit to look at the behavioral changes below, this is a different set of data within the first data set. And so on the left, that chart is showing value of wires sent out and how there was a spike between the month of June and July of 2019 by 2 types of customer types, which is free zone trading companies and free zone non-trading companies. So we see the spike, but the blue pointed line reflects a very sharp spike in value that peaked in July. And then the lower gray line is a trading free zone company. They really weren't doing anything terribly exciting during that period. But what else was not is not shown here is that as the value wired out increased, the number of these free zone non-trading companies decreased. And this was very significant because if we look at the second chart here, what this is essentially showing us in the blue line is that the value spiked. This is inbound value spiked in August. And as this value spiked, the numbers of companies receiving the value began to spike. Now, this may seem very complicated, but in terms of thinking about infiltration of criminal activity, or criminals just plainly said, what we can understand from these 2 tables here is that the spike in June was these companies, the same types of companies, free zone non-trading companies, sending funds out of this portfolio anyway, sending funds out and leaving this institution. However, the exact same type of wires were sent in the following month, that is to say in August, by a similar set of customers that were new customers. So let's move to the next slide. I'm conscious of time and I would like to leave some time for questions. In the next slide, what we will see here is from data set 2, these are transactional examples in country B and country C. So 2 different countries, and we're going to see several different patterns which indicate, well, a variety of potentially unusual activity. So this is again, funnel activity with numeric codes. Funnel activity meaning there's 2 types, meaning many originators to a single beneficiary, or a single originator sending to multiple beneficiaries. And those can be individuals or companies. So let's look at the chart on the left, which shows originator company Y sending to these beneficiaries. And of course, as I mentioned, all of these names are cleansed. So we used acronyms. CA does not mean Canada, it's a random acronym. So what we see here is company A sent 12 wires with a total amount of just $744 $8 wires were sent to CA, and then single wires were sent to the rest of the beneficiaries that all ended in 19 cents with 2 exceptions. The company Y also sent funds in 4 wires to beneficiaries in the US. Again, single wires to each beneficiary, and again, each wire ending in 19 cents. Because the 2 countries have different exchange rates for the originating country, it's not impossible, but it's very close to impossible to have all of these wires, with the 2 exceptions that I noted, ending in 19 cents. 11 of which ended in 19 cents. So then let's take another look over here on the lower right-hand side, which is country C, a different country. And again, we notice an originator sending to these beneficiary legal entities a series of wires, very large value wires that end all of them in 19 cents. Each one of which you don't see here, but each one of these beneficiary companies were located in different countries. And again, it does not really make sense why all of these wires for now 2 different countries with multiple beneficiaries are all ending in 19 cents. The possibility of that occurring and not being unusual is rather small. These wires were also accompanied by other types of what we would call red flags of unusual activity, one of which was microactivity bursts. In other words, these wires were sent in a very short period of time, usually over 1 to 2 days, and other times, multiple times on the same day. In the case of country B, the free-form field in these wires said current account, which doesn't make any sense because it's not, they would be sent to a current account that's a checking or a DDA account. The wires appeared to lack business purpose. They're the business of the originating company and the businesses of the individuals and beneficiaries were very dissimilar. And also very difficult to find information on the originators and the beneficiaries. Let's go to the next slide, please, for another example. And this one tries to illustrate the speed of adaptive behavior. So we had seen in the first example, approximately 8 months from for an activity, a geographic activity change to occur. Now we're going to see something a lot quicker. And so the first table that is titled July 19, this is showing, again, another example of a status quo. So for many months, the US, Canada, India, and Great Britain, which are the underneath the onshore, the 2 ISO acronyms, were always in the top, I would say the top senders of these funds. From July to August, however, a very big change occurred, which is illustrated both in the table at the right, as well as the, excuse me, the chart down below. And so not only did the value of incoming onshore wires change from 1.1 million in July to 4.5 million in August, but now instead of the 4 countries, we see US, China, India, and Great Britain, suddenly there is a change. And we see Hong Kong take the first place with 3 wires. And so, so this would have represented not only a transactional change, but in this case, a geographic change and a velocity change, because this change, and we can see it here very clearly, happened, appears to have happened within about 4 weeks. Excuse me. In actuality, it happened in about 2.5 weeks. And it was accompanied by another red flag of activity, which was in the the companies that were sending the 3 wires to a single beneficiary in Hong Kong. The 2 companies that were sending the wires used the same address in the country of origin. And they also sent round dollar wires. And they sent it to this one beneficiary with no address. So there were other activities and other indicators that could have been observed by a financial institution, possibly through an automated monitoring, but certainly also through perhaps an after-the-fact evaluation of this particular country, or perhaps looking specifically for geographic changes. So I know that my time is going quickly, and I'd like to.
Yeah, please move to your conclusions.
So I'm going to skip the next 2 slides and just move to slide 9 very quickly, please. And so slide 9, these are some of the conclusions. So in the case of dataset 1, we noticed that the number of active companies that were onshore companies and non-trading companies in free zones increased. This represented a behavioral shift by trading companies. There had been a lot of emphasis on trading companies, and in fact, FATF had published and has had FinCEN published an article about trading companies and free zones. And so there was a behavioral shift. That was also confirmed by the value that we had seen before. And then in data set 2, we determined that exchange rates within these 3 countries would not have had an effect and could not have had an effect on the consistent penny values found in these wires. So we conclude very quickly, to wrap up, that the purpose of using only 7 numeric combinations out of 100 possible combinations in the penny field seemed highly likely to indicate that this was a code used to send by the wire's originators to inform a nominal beneficiary of who should receive the funds next. So thank you for your time. I look forward to your questions. Back to you, Alberto.
Thanks a lot to you, Julia. And thanks for giving us this presentation and this very original use of data and information. As the next presenter, we will have Michele Riccardi from Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore and Transcrime. As I briefly mentioned, Michele will introduce and will reason on the concept of infiltration of organized crime into legal economy, and then it will move to a description and overview of different approaches for the measuring of this phenomenon. Thank you, Michele, for joining us. When you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alberto. Good morning or good evening to everyone. Buenos dias a todos. So thank you for the introduction. I will share my screen. So I hope you can see it. Organized crime infiltration is the typical issue which is at the center of the policy debate. Everybody talks about organized crime infiltration of the legal economy, but there is no agreement on what we are talking about. And this is the worst premise if we want to improve the knowledge and improve the measurement of this phenomenon. So the first issue, therefore, is trying to define organized crime infiltration. And I start with this somehow provocative assertion that infiltration is not necessarily a crime itself, in the sense that organized crime infiltration is somehow can be interpreted as a process which involves a number of crimes. Predicate crime, which are those which generate the money which is often used to infiltrate the economy, or those which are characterizing the individuals which are infiltrating the economy, or sentinel crime, which are those offenses which somehow characterize the infiltration process. And we have had today already some examples. Extortion may be one way to infiltrate the economy, in the sense that it can be the first step towards the acquisition of an existing business sometimes. Or corruption is another one, tax fraud is another one, and of course money laundering is another somehow sentinel crime of infiltration. Trying to provide a definition of organized crime infiltration, we can focus on that of infiltration of legitimate businesses, which is somehow the one which is the probably most or among the most important type of infiltration, but also the most unknown. And in previous work, scholars have tried to provide a definition of organized crime infiltration. I mentioned here one which we adopted in the past, defining infiltration as any case in which a natural person belonging to a criminal organization invests financial or human resources to participate in the decision-making process of a legitimate firm. And this is somehow an operational definition, which then can be applied to a number of contexts and situations. If we take this as a benchmark, somehow operational definition, then we can try to measure infiltration. And making a sort of short or quick review of existing measurement approaches, I think that we can identify two main approaches. The first is that what I called direct measures of infiltration, which entail all those cases in which to be measured is the outcome of the infiltration process, and especially proxies of firms which are infiltrated by organized crime, or at least proxies of those firms which are infiltrated, but then have been detected by the judicial authority or by other authorities. And so there are seized and confiscated firms, firms targeted by administrative measures, or those owned by individuals who have been sanctioned or are under investigation. While for indirect measure, I mean two approaches which are increasingly important in the literature, both in the academic one and institutional literature. The first is that looking at the risk factors of organized crime infiltration, somehow following the FATF concept of also money laundering risk assessment, so identifying the risk factors facilitating money laundering in that case, and in this one, the risk factors facilitating or characterizing infiltration, or other studies looking at the impact of organized crime infiltration. So I will go quickly along these, providing some examples and then reaching some conclusion. So the first, which I mentioned, is related to the analysis of seized and confiscated firms. In the past years, we had some examples of application of this methodology in a number of countries. Here you can have some examples. Most of them are in Europe. The application of this approach in outside Europe has not been as common, and there is really a limited number of studies. The second is related to the analysis of firms which have been targeted by administrative measures. And here I make two examples. In Italy, we have these interdittive, which are measures which hit firms which are under suspicion of being influenced by organized crime, and are issued in order to avoid these firms can participate to public procurement, for example. Or in the Netherlands, we have this BIBOP Act, which is an administrative measure which is applied in order to ban and avoid these firms to get public licenses to operate in certain municipalities. But the analysis of these cases have been really limited. The third case is related to the analysis of firms and assets controlled by organized crime members. There is some, I mean, one of the first studies to adopt this approach were in the US in the 70s and the 80s, but then much more expanded the application in Europe, and again here some example. What has been done here? Well, this approach of using direct measure have been employed to analyze the distribution across geographic areas. For example, here you can see the distribution of 3,500 confiscated firms in Italy, across Italian regions, or the distribution across economic sectors. Here you have a distribution of confiscated firms across economic sectors in 5 European countries. Or correlation with contextual variables, analysis of legal forms, so pattern of ownership structure. For example, here you can see an analysis that was made to check the role of women as shareholders and owners of confiscated firms. Other scholars have analyzed financial reports of these firms and financial ratios. So the assumption behind is that we can measure confiscated firms or firms owned by organized criminals to understand how and what are the characteristics of infiltrated businesses. Of course, this is a strong assumption, and it basically leads to a number of challenges. The first is are direct measures are a measure of infiltration itself or of law enforcement activity. And therefore, they may mirror somehow the limited scope or the problems in the activity of law enforcement and judicial authorities. So somehow they may overestimate the national and regional scope of infiltrated businesses and assets. They often depict simple or simplistic corporate schemes, and we are not sure if this is because organized criminals prefer more easier corporate schemes, or rather if these are those which can be more easily detected by law enforcement. And they may overestimate the role of traditional infiltration strategies, such as the use of family figureheads. So the idea is that the easier you are, the more easy is also to detect you and to confiscate the firm. They can be also biased by asset recovery regulation and practices. For example, in most countries, the number of confiscated firms is really, really, really low. Only in few countries we have a substantial number of seized businesses. The other problem is the time lag between investigation and confiscation. So if we analyze confiscated assets, then we are probably looking at an outdated, vintage picture of infiltration. And the last problem is the fragmentation of data across different repositories and sources, because in the asset recovery funnel, the number of actors and data sources is very wide, even within the same country. So in order to somehow overcome some of these problems, the use of indirect measures have somehow expanded in recent years. So as said, the first is the analysis of risk factors and markers of infiltration. This, as said, was suggested somehow by the same approach adopted and recommended by FATF in the money laundering domain. And the same risk factors of money laundering are very often also risk factors of infiltration. Cash intensity, this was studied by a number of scholars, the opacity and the complexity of firms' ownership, or the association between irregular labor and labor tax avoidance and firm activity. The other dimension of indirect measure is the analysis of the impact of organized crime infiltration. This has been a quite successful strand of analysis in Italy, at least, related to the impact of mafia infiltration of legitimate businesses. Although all these studies somehow rely on the use of certain direct measures of infiltration. Here I report some example of risk factors. So these are quite the outcome of some quite recent Transcrime research projects, in which we mapped with an analysis of big data, and in particular of 25 million companies in Europe, the distribution across European regions of firms with anomalous complex ownership structure, with of firms controlled by trust, foundation, fiduciaries, or of cash-intensive firms. I skip the technical and methodological details. Of course, if you're interested, we can discuss it later on. So this is just an example of an application of this indirect approach towards the analysis of where risk factors of infiltration can distribute. Now, even this approach has its own weaknesses and biases. There is much discussion about risk factors, but not all of them are then empirically validated. And also, I think that it is suffering some lack of specification. The existence of opacity of firm ownership may point to infiltration by organized crime, but also to tax fraud, to money laundering, to false invoicing, and many other phenomena, and even legal ones. The impact also suffers of some problems, reverse causality, for example, or confounding effects, which often cannot be quite easily distinguished. So to conclude, I think that just a matter to check that also empirically validation, however, can be resolved in a way. We, for example, try to validate risk factors related to the opacity and complexity of firms with the statistics on sanction and enforcement taken from databases used for compliance purposes by banks. And this was an exercise on about 13 million firms. And this was a way to empirically validate if, in fact, risk factors, at least the specific risk factors, can have some predictive power or can be used to really somehow depict where risks are. Now, to conclude, as said, despite the centrality in the policy debate, I think that the empirically research on organized crime infiltration is still quite low, limited to few countries, especially in Europe, because, first of all, of challenges in data methodology. However, I think that there are opportunities which have been emerged in the past few months and years, which allow a better measurement of this phenomenon, and also the exercises and analyses which have been carried out in Europe, I think can be repeated in some other countries as well, even in Latin America, especially in those somehow having a governance type organized crime like the Italian one, and thinking about Mexico, Colombia, and other. Just three, I think, suggestion or let's say thoughts for future direction. I think that we shall avoid too much economic or financial emphasis on this analysis, but we shall stress instead the criminological perspective and the ethnographic perspective. Infiltrated businesses are not businesses as any other one. The utility functions of criminals are not the same of entrepreneurs or multinational firms or whatever. And so we really need to combine, I think, the financial and economic perspective with a more criminological point of view to really better understand this phenomenon. Thank you.
Thank you, Michele, for your very comprehensive and clear presentation and for offering us this food of thought that will certainly come back now in the roundtable discussion. Thank you a lot. As I was saying, we already received quite a lot of questions by our audience. And if you have other ones, please go on putting them in the opposite question and answer chat. I will start picking one that has been posed to Patricio. And the question is more articulated, but I will ask you to focus on the reasoning on, they are asking you, aside victimization surveys, which are other possible sources of information and data to quantitatively analyze extortion, and in particular extortion by organized crime groups. So do you think the source of information we are using basically the best one or the only one, or there are other approaches you can suggest to the audience?
Thank you, Alberto. And thank you for the question. It's very interesting, and I'm just gonna open it up here to read it. So the person that asked also asked whether specific 1-800 lines, such telephones, anonymous phone lines where you can report extortion incidents, are those are they effective? Do they help to reduce underreporting? The bottom line is we don't really know how effective these lines are. I mean, at least I don't know. I've never seen any research published in that area. But as a general rule, I would expect that having more ways to report crime, not only extortion, but all crimes, is always going to be positive. And especially in the case of extortion, when we only have victimization surveys to capture a little bit more faithfully the type of the incidence and prevalence of this crime compared to administrative statistics, having different sources to sort of check and provide a triangulation to sort of measure, to see if the patterns we're measuring are consistent, it's always going to be a good thing. So I would say that having those type of lines to receive reports are good, but I would also work with business organizations and business chambers of commerce and those type of businesses to encourage businesses to have a accounting, internal accounting that they can share among themselves about the number and type of incidents that they suffer. Of course, that would only cover certain type of businesses, larger businesses more likely than smaller businesses that have the capability to do this type of measurement. But as I said, we're never going to have too much data, and it can be the work of researchers afterwards to sift through that data and see which of it is good and which of it is not that good. In another part of your question, you also asked whether victimization surveys are able to capture vulnerable sectors, occupation, as well as repeat victimization, types of offenders, and the modus operandi. I would say that victimization surveys probably are better placed to answer those type of questions than administrative records, because they have been specifically designed to measure extortion, whereas administrative records, the measurement is a byproduct of an administrative procedure. That being said, I do think that victimization surveys can be improved to measure those type of issues. As I said in the presentation, one of the biggest issues in the Mexican case is to make sure that the definition of extortion is very clear and that we are measuring the two different type of extortions separately. And that would, and there are certainly other improvements that can be made to the victimization survey, specifically to the victims form, to get more context, but there's a limit to how much information can get in a quantitative manner that fits all possible situations and forms in which extortion takes place. So I would also say that we also need more, and echoing what Michele just said, more ethnographic approaches, more qualitative studies of victims to understand the process of extortion, how extortion happens, and then we can understand a little bit more what we can do to stop sort of those interactions, stop those victimizations.
Thanks a lot, Patricio, for your very clear and interesting answer to the question. Following the order of the presentation, I will pose one of the numerous questions that have been raised to Rusudan Mikhelidze, and in particular, I will focus as first on this one that is asking basically, according to the Gnostics, what are the main causes of the vulnerability of anti-corruption systems? So from your methodology and your approach, what emerged as the most relevant? And related to this, I will add, if you can specify also if these factors that emerge with respect to corruption, in your understanding, may have a strong link also to the organized crime dimension, or perhaps we might not know. Thank you,
Well,
Rusudan.
thank you for the question. While we have not done specific analysis of organized crime to the challenges that exist in the areas of our study in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, I can definitely name the areas that are most vulnerable in the region in the context of good governance, fight against corruption, and that also increase the risk of organized crime and infiltration. And one of them that I named, and I would like to pick this one again, is the Independence Judiciary. That has been a problem across the board in the countries that we look at, in 25 countries of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. I can share a detailed study of 4 years of peer reviews, as well as the analysis of other countries outside the 10 that I just named, and there the weakness of judiciary and corrupt judiciary, also controlled by the specific loyal judges instead of the good self-government of judiciary, that has promoted also vulnerabilities to corruption and organized crime. The second one that I would like to stress is the high-level corruption. And when the oligarchs are in control, obviously, it is much more vulnerable to organized crime. The system is much more vulnerable. And our priority at this point is to fight high-level corruption. We're focusing specifically on government's efforts on that to promote and stimulate that, and we have a specific performance area fighting high-level corruption as one of the 13 areas. And lastly, I would like to focus on our matrix of high-level corruption cases, and this is very important as well, to look at the OECD Working Group on Bribery has the foreign bribery cases matrix, which is a collection of cases that are in open sources or get communicated to the OECD otherwise, and on which the Working on Bribery exercises peer pressure for the law enforcement to investigate and prosecute the relevant cases. And we will start the similar on high-level corruption, and we will get the information from open data sources, from citizens, and we will put pressure on the governments to investigate and prosecute high-level corruption cases, which in our opinion will also have effect on decreasing the risk factors or prevalence of organized crime. I hope that answers it. Thank you again.
Thank you, Rusudan. And with specific respect to the corruption of the judicial system and the high-level political system, I think you also agree or met the indication or the debate that is happening, let's say, in the chat. Different of members of the audience were pointing their comments in that direction, and I'm sure they will be happy to have the confirmation from your in-depth analysis. Again, following the order, I will turn to Julia Molt, and I will make her a technical question that I think is very relevant to fully understand the potential and the interpretation to be given to the analysis that you're conducting. And in particular, from the audience, they're asking you how frequently are legitimate transactions mistakenly characterized as suspicious under the current data-driven model? First part, let's say, of the question. And in the second question, they're asking, will switching to a more intuitive, human-centered approach increase or decrease the likelihood of legitimate transaction being red flagged? So they are asking basically on how able are suspicious transactions to actually depict and represent illicit transaction or money laundering activities, which I think is a basic and fundamental element to understand your work.
Well, I hope I've captured both questions correctly, but let's start with the first. How frequently are legitimate customer transactions classified as atypical or irregular? I don't, oddly enough, I don't think there's any data to support any suggestion I might make. I could really only speak from my own experience, but I think underlying that question is a much broader issue that faces all of our industries and governments, which is how reliable is the data? How knowledgeable are the people who are looking at the data and interpreting it and reporting on it? And then what actions are being taken? So what I would say is that most of what I've discussed in my presentation was not alerted by a monitoring system. And the reason for that is because one transaction alone does not create a pattern of potentially illegal activity. You really have to have a different time horizon, which implies more transactions. I would be shocked to see a single transaction be an indicator of an STR, for example, that needed to be escalated up the line to the FIU. So I can't really answer the question, how often does it happen? I'm sure it happens. I would not be surprised. It could be misinterpretations. It could be customer refused to provide information. If you'd had that information, you would have made a much better informed decision. The second part of the question, if you could just mention that broadly, it was a complicated question.
Yeah, sorry, definitely.
Yes.
The second part of the question was dealing with the automatization of the process. And basically the question was asking if a more human-centered approach, instead of, I suppose, the assumption is that the system is completely artificial intelligence driven, may provide better results and reduce the bias, let's say, in your estimates or in the identification of money laundering schemes.
Right, and bias is a very, it's actually a critical topic, and we could probably talk about that all day. In fact, there's bias in the investigators as well. And it manifests itself in this respect, is that country A, every time I have to file an STR, it's coming from country A, or the transactions are going to country A. So now the investigator starts to build their own bias. Even if they didn't investigate perhaps as thoroughly as they should have, they're going to perhaps be persuaded to say, well, it has an impact or a nexus to country A, and so I'm going to escalate it. But as far as automation, I would not have an all manual system. It's too time consuming. It doesn't produce the results. Now, on the other hand, would I have a completely automated system? That's the other extreme, right? No, because again, it depends on how do you refresh that knowledge that's caught in your data. Do you keep the same thresholds for 10 years as your customers perhaps transact at higher levels or lower levels? It's a calibrated act. And so we started out with talking about the infiltration of criminal organizations. They changed behavior very quickly, as I tried to show in my presentation. They changed behavior much more quickly than probably most financial institutions and other types of governmental and sovereign FIUs and investigations and police do as well. Given that, to rely entirely on automation or entirely on the manual approach just doesn't seem to make sense. But the automation aspect cannot just be off the shelf. It has to really be tailored to what you're trying to receive or understand. It has to be tailored to the values that you're seeing. And it's a constant dynamic refresh for the rules, for the thresholds, and for the scenarios. I mean, rules don't produce entirely 100% great results all the time. Sorry, that's another whole discussion we could have a panel on.
Thanks a lot. It's a clear and honest answer on this relevant point. I will now move to a question to Michele. the question connects to the last things that you mentioned about the importance of evaluating and taking into consideration that companies and firms that get infiltrated by organized crime might actually be different from, let's say, the average company. So I'm going to ask you if you can provide us some indication of this difference, what you have in mind, and at the same time, if you, in your long experience and in all the cases you analyze, you had experience of very large companies that have been infiltrated by organized crime.
Okay, thank you. I will try to do a miracle and answer in 3 minutes. But let's start from the differences. There are many differences, strictly relying on empirical evidence and the findings of
empírica, y de ahí viene de esta información.
Report, just to mention some. Given the analysis, infiltrated companies and seized companies from organized crime have higher tax debts than other firms, have higher share of current assets, have a higher share of debtors, so debts with suppliers, and this makes sense thinking about how they are managed. There are differences in terms of ownership, from quite, I would say, provocative elements. For example, we discovered that in Italy, the firms seized from Italian organized crime have twice the number of women as owners than the rest of Italian companies. And this is not obviously because mafia promotes female entrepreneurship, but because they make wide use of figureheads. And the same apparently is happening in other countries as well. But also they have predictors and anomalies in ownership structure, like anomalous complexity. They have a long, complex chain which are not rational from a strict economic or financial point of view. And also they are different in terms of how they distribute across business sectors. The weight of these firms in hotels, restaurants, cash-intensive sectors such as gaming, for example, and in recent years, even renewable energy, for example, is much higher than if we compare them to the universe of legal companies. In terms of size, I mean, again, here you can find whatever. Most of the infiltrated companies are firms which are more often shell companies, very small, with basically void content. But we have example of quite large firms. And just to provide you a case, in Italy, we had 2 years ago the first listed companies, which was a listed company, which was listed on a stock exchange, and it was put under judicial administration because it was infiltrated by associated of Cosa Nostra family. It was put under judicial administration for 2 years, and this was a listed companies trading on a stock exchange again, and it was eventually owned by public authorities in the northern region of Lombardy. It was the company managing the International Fair Exhibition. So, I mean, there are many instances. It's difficult to make one single profile. Reason why, as said, probably we must really drill down and try to understand with an ethnographic approach as well all the details and how they work and how they operate, because I think we are just at the beginning of a knowledge journey.
Thank you, Michele, for being able to stay in a very short time and answer to this complex question. We have very, very few seconds. I will avoid of wrapping up and summarize the intervention. I will not be able to do justice to the very interesting presentation of 4 experts and to the interaction with our audience in these last few seconds. So I will just take the occasion to once again thanks enormously our four panelists for their very interesting presentation, to thanks UNODC, INEGI, and CONSTAT for promoting, organizing, and supporting this very relevant initiative, and to thanks all the audience who attended this panel and participated it with all these questions. Thanks again for your attendance and attention. I now leave the turn to Mr. José María Izabal for the concluding remarks. Thanks again. Have a nice day or nice evening.
Thank you very much to all the panelists. Sin duda, la naturaleza de las organizaciones del crimen organizado implica que entendamos su actuar y operación de manera detallada.
Is that we have to act in details within and outside our national borders. We want to thank all the speakers for the excellent presentations, moderators as well, and I want to thank all of you for being with us. Normally, my colleagues will be sharing a chat for you to assess